here are the facts. Social Security will be insolvent by 2034. There's only a few solutions to viably fix it, which aren't popular. Nothing Econoboi is going to say will dispute these facts, so Econoboi will concede the debate at the beginning and tell us all how to fix a broken system. Yet by doing so, he admits it is broken, which is my position. Right now, our birth rate's at 1.6. On average, we have too few young people to support the old, even with the immigration waves. Women entered the workforce, giving Social Security a big boon, but now they are retiring, and we have to pay out to them as well. The government has no obligations, as ruled by the Supreme Court, to pay out Social Security benefits when it goes insolvent. If nothing is done when Social Security becomes insolvent, the entitlements will probably continue, but at a lower rate than they are right now by some significantly large percentage, though it's unknown how much. It could be as low as 40%, could be as low as 70%, may not even be there. They just don't know. Social Security isn't a great system. My opponent will likely just say, let's increase the payroll tax. That seems to be what progressives always say. Why do they say this? Well, because within their worldview, they enjoy immensely hurting the working class, especially the lower class, which the payroll tax hurts the worst. This is my opening in the Social Security debate. I don't really know how it can be argued with, but I'll pass it over to Econoboi if he wants to try.
Yeah, sure. So my thoughts on Social Security are as follows. I would say that Social Security has been one of the most successful government welfare programs that the U.S. government, at least, has ever implemented. Since the implementation and sort of full-scale adoption of Social Security has come online, elderly poverty has decreased by a very, very large percentage. Relative poverty has also gone down by a large percentage. There's much less sort of burdensome financial precariousness that's faced with families with regard to their aging parents. And one metric to realize that is that there's been a decline of about a third of the proportion of elderly people in a shared living arrangement. And so when we think about Social Security, most people get more out of it than they put in. Most people end up being more financially independent than they'd otherwise be able to be in their elderly years. And so therefore, it's a good program to fund. Now, with regard to the solvency of the program, there was a report released by the Social Security Administration, I believe in 2020. As far as I'm aware, they might do an annual report. I'm not really sure. That showed that the old age survivors insurance trust fund essentially would have a net outflow for the first time, or rather would go to zero, I should say, in 2034. The other pension fund for disabled people is going to be solvent for another 40 or 50 years. Probably not that big a deal. Now, with regard to 2034 timeline, there are two possibilities. One possibility is raising revenue in a creative way, which you could say, invest in more risky securities, a diversified index that would extend the fund of the program by 4 or 5 years. That's one way. You could also raise the retirement age. That's another way that's been experimented with, it seems, in our current system. But in general, what I would say is that the other way could be raise the payroll tax as well. What I would say is that a marginal increase in the payroll tax is probably worth the extended solvency of the program. The thing is, though, is that we don't actually have to increase the payroll tax only on lower income people. Right now, the Social Security payroll tax is actually capped at about $110,000, $112,000 a year. And if we just removed that cap, you'd actually solve half of the decline in funds all the way through. I think it's like 2050 or 60 or something like that. And that's assuming that you actually adjust the payout schedule. So the more you pay into Social Security, the proportionally more you get out of it. If you adjust that to get even more out of it, if you tax wealthier people more, it turns out you still solve more than half of that gap, and that's without raising taxes on any lower income person. If you don't adjust the payout rate, it's 74%. So all of these solutions combined lead to a relatively equitable distribution of Social Security funds and in such a way that's sustainable in the long term.
Okay, so just to deconstruct this, do you agree with me that the current rate, as projected, is that Social Security is going to be insolvent in 2034?
That's what the SSA says, so I guess I'm bound to agree with that.
Okay, gotcha. And do you agree with me that I assume that your position would be that you would just want to raise the payroll taxes to fix it?
No, I offered three distinct solutions. The ones
But
that
the
I'm
one
most
that you
favorable towards,
have is payroll tax for most favorable
the
towards,
the
right?
two that I'm most favorable towards is investing in a broader index of assets to extend the life of the trust fund, and also getting rid of the cap on Social Security payroll tax.
So payroll tax.
Yeah, only on wealthier people, but sure.
So no, it's not on wealthier people. That's a lie. There's not enough money that you can take from wealthier people because most wealthy people aren't on a payroll, are they?
I'm not really sure what you're referencing. Obviously, the payroll tax is
I'm referencing a payroll tax as a tax on payroll. Do wealthy
right.
people
So
get
what?
paychecks usually?
Well, there's many wealthy people that are taxed on ordinary income, right? And so I don't think that that's totally unusual. I would say that the Social
No,
Security
it's totally
report.
unusual.
Well,
Tell
let
me.
me finish. So the Social Security report that you're referencing that says that Social Security will go insolvent by 2034 also says that if we remove this cap on payroll tax, it would
Mhm.
close a majority of the deficit in the trust fund up to 2034. And if we don't adjust the payout schedule, it would close three
Well,
quarters of that gap.
but it
That's
doesn't
without.
say that. Okay, so you're misframing this already. You're full of shit.
I'm
It
not.
doesn't
I'm
tell
quoting the
you.
report.
Okay, you're quoting the report, but you're omitting key facts, which is it doesn't just say to remove the payroll tax on the wealthy, does it?
It does. That's one of the main solvencies
Show
that you
me.
could do. In fact, well, I can show you, but I'll finish this. In fact,
Go ahead.
Medicare Medicare had a similar tax that was removed in 1990 that helped extend the solvency of Medicare for 30 years. And so
Mhm.
I think that in a similar basically you're either going to take the report at face value or not. You can't cite the report and then not cite the rest of the report, which says that one of the solvencies would be what I just mentioned. I'll get the screenshot for you, but respond to what I just said if you want.
Okay, I'm going to respond to what you just said. You will not make Social Security solvent by just raising payroll tax on wealthy people. It's absurd. Literally, it's
Um,
absurd.
okay, so we've kind of moved the goalpost here a little bit.
No, I
So
haven't moved the goalpost.
well, you definitely have. I would just say that with regard to this issue, you're right that 57% and I think it's 74% is not the entire way to that deficit. And so if you wanted to say, okay, that combined with some sort of mixed asset allocation, that might extend it, 80, 90% of the way there. What about that final 10%? And at that
No,
point,
what they want to
I'm not
do is they
shy.
want to raise the payroll tax across the board on all Americans, which is going to disproportionately hurt the people at the bottom rungs of society like it always does. And then second, it'll hurt the middle class harder than it'll hurt anybody. The ultra wealthy and uber wealthy, they don't get paychecks, they don't pay payroll tax. They hide assets, they hardly pay capital gains taxes, they hardly pay any fucking taxes.
Yeah, so there's not really a great empirical justification for this. So the payroll tax has been raised from 1% when it was originally, I suppose, determined back in the 1930s or 40s or whenever it was, all the way up to 6.2% today, matched by the employer. Now, with Medicare, there's a literal exact one-to-one example of a cap on higher income people paying into the Medicare tax
We're not talking
being
about
lifted. And
Medicare.
so,
We're talking about
well,
Social
I
Security.
understand.
It's much
No,
larger than
no, no.
Medicare.
Fundamentally, what we're talking about is removing a cap of taxes on the wealthiest income earners, right? Or the highest income earners is what I should say. And what I am saying is that there's empirical justification to do it. There's actually historical justification for the idea that it's likely that it will happen. Whereas you're saying there's actually no chance it'll happen because wealthy people don't pay very much in taxes. It's not true. It's not empirically bore out in any sense of the word.
Who would you say would be the most likely people to write legislation to make Social Security solvent again? Would that be politicians, do you think? Lobbyists?
Well, our government, I'm not sure what you mean. So our government writes legislations, representative democracy. So I'd assume it'd be the
Gotcha.
politicians
Do
or,
you know
yeah,
that
go on.
it's mostly young people don't vote? That it's mostly people in the middle age and elderly people who vote?
Yeah, one of the most powerful lobbies that we have in this country is the AARP, and they're one of the most
Yeah.
pivotal reasons why we haven't seen huge cuts in Social Security and why whenever
Right.
we have solvency issue, well, really quick, whenever we have solvency issue with Social Security or Medicare, it tends to be the case that they're extended in terms of their life, right? And
Yeah,
so I
right.
think,
Got it. That's my whole point. So my whole point is that the chances that elderly people are going to vote to slash their own benefits isn't very high, is it?
I never I never advocated for slashing
I
benefits.
didn't say that you did. Just please answer my question.
I'm not sure how it's relevant, but to answer your question, no, I don't imagine elderly people
Okay,
would
no,
vote to
you
slash
don't.
their own benefits.
So that's going to probably get rid of the option of slashing benefits altogether. So we're going to lean into what's probably the most viable from a politician's standpoint, because that's what matters more than anything else. What matters is what legislation's actually going to get passed based on the people that politicians have to lobby to. No fucking politician in their right mind is going to ever advocate for slashing Social Security benefits. They're only ever going to advocate for raising taxation. Now, the justification on raising taxation for the wealthy is pretty good. The problem is that the wealthy own the lobbyists. And so when the lobbyists write up the bills for increasing taxation, who does it most often seem to go to, Econoboi?
Sure. So my question to this would be why they do it with the Medicare tax, but they wouldn't do it with the Social Security tax if the lobbyists just buy our government?
Because it's called scalability. One, you're going to have to increase a hell of a lot more than the other. That's one. But two, you really haven't contended with this question. Don't you think that the chances that the middle class and the lower class are going to get an increase to their payroll taxes in order to make Social Security solvent again is probably high?
No, I actually think it's more likely that at least in the medium term, they do the solutions that I would describe rather than yours. Because again, what we see over time, at least with democracies and with good fiscal governance, is what you see is that it's actually the middle class that are the least likely to be taxed over time. And it seems like politicians are more likely to raise taxes on the wealthy than otherwise.
I see. It's most likely that they're going to raise taxes on the wealthy, in your opinion.
The last thing any politician wants to do, and this is bore out, is raise taxes on the middle and lower class.
Well, sure, but they hide it, right? They always hide what the tax increase is going to be by calling it something else, don't they? And then it ends up being a tax increase on the middle class anyway. Well, who knows how they'll package it? It's all in language. But what ends up always happening is that the lower class and middle class ends up having to pay out big time. What's going to end up happening in this case is the same exact thing. What's going to happen is Social Security is going to go insolvent probably before 2034. That's just a projection. Okay. And what's going to end up happening is necessarily they're going to have to raise taxes across the board in order to take care of the retirees who their life expectancy is increasing, right? And our birth rate's going down. This is the most likely scenario that's going to happen that we're going to actually see bore out. You saying that there's a one-to-one between Medicare, the Medicare cap, and things like this. So what? These are not of scale to Social Security, which is a monstrous entitlement program that affects, a large swath of the entire nation. Everybody who works is involved in it in some way. So the chances that payroll taxes are going to increase on the middle and lower class are very, very, very high. Whether you think so or you don't think so, chances are good. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you repeat what you just said? My internet cut out.
The whole
just
thing?
The last part. Just the last part.
I said the chances that the middle class and lower class are going to end up having to pay more in payroll taxes in order to make this system solvent, considering where our birth rate is, and considering that by the time Social Security goes insolvent, the life expectancy may drastically increase in comparison to what our birth rate is. Chances are good that this is going to be a middle class and lower class tax increase, even if you raise the cap on the wealthy.
Yeah, so I agree that the full sort of solvency of Social Security isn't solved by getting rid of that cap. All that I'm saying is that it's a very marginal increase in the taxes for middle and lower income people if it actually were to come to that in the first place. Now, again, I don't really know if that's necessarily a W for you, because what you have to prove over the course of this debate isn't necessarily that taxes are going to increase to pay for it. You have to prove that the taxes going into the system are not worth going into the system. And I think
you don't frame what the victory conditions are for a debate. One, for what I have to prove or not prove. What I proved was that my position that Social Security was going to be insolvent and that the chances are good that the progressive you would want to raise taxes in order to solve the crisis of it have now been borne out as being factual.
Well, not really. I mean, that's just you saying I can't frame the way that you would win this debate, but you should prefer my framing, right? But that doesn't really make any sense. I think that the
That's what I
better way
set
to
out to
evaluate
prove.
the
I didn't
better
set out to
the
prove anything
better
else.
well, no, but that's a ridiculous way to do public policy. Like, for instance, if we provide temporary funding for something and we were to say, well, that funding temporarily is only temporary, it's going to expire. The question of should we renew the program isn't, well, the program is running out of money, isn't it? Right? No, the question is the program good? Is it worth funding? And what Social Security is fundamentally is one of the best poverty alleviating programs in the history of our government that has ever been implemented. And that's what you have to contend with. Just saying that Social Security is running low on money isn't to say that Social Security is
Well,
bad
just
at all.
saying
It's
that
not to say it's not worth
it
funding.
worked really well when we had a completely different demographic makeup of the United States is a non sequitur anyway.
It's
Don't
working
you
really well
agree?
today.
Don't you agree that before women entered the workplace, that Social Security may have become insolvent long before now? It's just that when women were allowed to work, there was a surplus, and now they're retiring, and we're having to pay out to them as well, which created a large part of this insolvency problem. And you have a lot more people who are getting more out than they ever put in, which again was not the way that the system was ever designed to be set up.
Um, so wait. So you think that there are people getting a lot more out than they ever put in? Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's the opposite of what you said in your debate with Hans. One of the claims you made was that, oh, well, Social Security is terrible because you don't get as much out as you pay in. It's good to know you've
No,
reversed that, at least
you
for the
need to
purpose
learn
of
how
this
to
debate.
contextualize things.
Okay, sure.
When me and Hans were discussing this, what I said to Hans specifically is that there's a lot of people who end up paying their entire life into that system and barely get anything out because the life expectancy rate increases. Right. So what you're doing is you're conflating two different things and then pretending like there's a positional flip flop. Just because I say that there's a lot of people who end up paying a lot into this system and don't get nearly as much out as they put in, it does not mean that most people aren't getting more out of the system than they put in.
Well, in that debate, you also said that life expectancy isn't actually going up significantly because the reason that life expectancy has gone up is only because the child mortality has gone down. It's not because people are actually living longer. But that was dead wrong as well.
That's also not true. You're fucking lying through your teeth.
I'm not.
What I said is that they use an average for infant mortality rate in order to judge life expectancy. Would you like me to prove that to you?
Would you like me to prove what?
Would you like what I said in that debate was that they use infant mortality rates in order to come up with the number for life expectancy. That's what I said.
Yeah, I believe the context of that comment was Hans saying that doesn't raising the retirement age make some sense if we're living a lot longer. And your response was that we're not actually living a lot longer. It's because rather there's a lot less babies dying. And that average is being pulled up, not because we're living longer lives, but because people aren't dying as children anymore.
Yeah, I
right?
don't
But you're
believe
saying the
you
opposite here.
because you framed the first thing incorrectly, and I think that you're just framing this incorrectly too. All
That's
I've
fair.
ever stated as my position over and over and over again was that the average life expectancy is determined by using the infant mortality rate, which is true.
All right. Well, even framing it that way, we still are living a lot longer past the age of 65. At least that's the best way to frame it under that framework. If you don't believe me, that's fine. But
I
I would
believe
just
it's
ask
70.
you,
I believe it's 72 now.
72, the average age.
I think that they raised it originally. Social Security, I think that they raised originally, I think it was 60, 65 or 60 or in the low 60s, and now it's 72 for full rates. I'll have to check. I think it's something in there.
I believe to get full benefits, you end up at 67. I believe that you are incentivized to some extent to take it at 70 if you want. But that's obviously a
who
different.
cares? The point being is, one more time, you keep on. Well, why are you straw manning over to a Hans debate anyway?
I'm not. It seemed like you're taking very, very different stances based on the two debates, and I just want to be clear as to what your actual position is, right?
Well, I have given you my actual position on it. My actual position is that you just want to raise taxes in order to make sure that the system is solvent, when we could easily privatize the system, and it would make people a lot more money if we did.
Sure. So, okay, so I guess that's a valuable pivot to the next part of the conversation, right? So So I guess fundamentally, you would take the position that Social Security is not worth investing in. Like it's better to
No,
just have everyone.
because we don't know what shifting demographics are going to look like by the time we get. So you could maybe put a Band-Aid on it to make it solvent, but you don't know what the demographics will look like 30 years after that. You might have to do something drastic again. Just pointing to the success of the Social Security program when we had stable demographics and everything was kind of going in the favor of Social Security via the baby boom, women entering the workforce, the amount of retirees coming out versus the amount of young people that you had to tax to pay them out, is not a recipe for what future generations are going to have to deal with, considering the shifting demographics in the United States.
Right. So I would say that with regard to the idea that we should privatize Social Security, I suppose it depends on what you actually mean by privatize Social Security. I've already proposed the idea of taking the trust fund and investing it into private funds in order to allocate those funds a little bit more efficiently, get a little bit more return on your dollar, on your trust fund dollar. That'll extend the life of the program a few years, a little bit more sustainably. It's partially what Norway does with their pension fund. It's what a lot of countries do with their pension fund. The U.S. just has this weird constraint on only investing in treasuries, right? So you get a little bit less return.
Yeah, and bonds.
Treasuries are bonds. It's just a different word for bonds. So
yeah, it's bonds. And what are bonds paying out in interest rate now? Like 2%?
Yeah, it's around 2%. So
and it was at 5%.
Was it 5%?
I think it was 5%. Yeah.
Bond yields go up and down over time.
The way now we're dealing with inflation, so then now we're at 2%, I believe. I believe it was inflation that's caused the decline in the interest percentage on bonds.
No, if we had long and sustained inflation, interest would actually go up because you'd have to mitigate for the risk of inflation within your bond yields, right? So it's a market determined rate fundamentally, and so it's it's not really surprising to hear that yields have gone down over time as inflation has gone down. And in response to this uptick in inflation, you wouldn't really expect bond yields to go up immediately because expectations are somewhat anchored. That's kind of an irrelevant point because Social Security payments are adjusted for inflation anyway, and so inflation isn't as much of a concern for people getting Social Security today. Rather, what I would rather talk about is what is the actual effect of privatizing Social Security. That's really, I think, the better conversation. What do you imagine in terms of privatizing Social Security looks like? Just get rid of Social Security, have a mandatory retirement system, just let people do whatever they want. What's your advocacy?
Say the last part of that question again. I was just reading how you're wrong about bonds, but go ahead. What was the end of that question?
Well, I want to hear how I'm wrong, BPF. Tell me.
On inflation, and we'll get to it in a second. But give me the last part of the question.
Okay, we'll get to it in a second. I'll hold you to it. So, the question is, what's your actual advocacy? Do we just get rid of the system, let people do what they want? Do we have a mandatory private, insurance scheme? What do you imagine in terms of a retirement system? But I guess tell me how I'm wrong first.
You could do it one of three ways. All right.
Tell me how first.
I'm trying to. The first way that you can deal with it is you can just get rid of Social Security altogether. The entitlement program in and of itself, which I have absolutely no problem with. None. I think that people are much more responsible when it comes to making their investments now as they've ever been, and that you're going to have winners and losers just like you do right now with Social Security, of which even at the maximum benefit, the elderly people who don't have other things like Roth IRAs, et cetera, they're not exactly living their best life, man. So that's one. The first thing is you can just abandon the system. The second thing that I would say that maybe you could push into would be some type of privatization, which is would be similar to a 401k system, just managed by the government instead. I would probably not like to see that except as a last resort. Okay. And then the third way that you can do this is you can have the government invest in the actual market with Social Security funds, giving you a huge return if you're using safe market bets. And you can probably pay people a lot more money than they've ever seen. But I don't see that happening either. So the stock market would be very resistant to that. And they would probably call it market tampering and everything else. So probably privatization would be the middle ground that I could meet you on.
Okay, sure. So getting rid of Social. Well, wait, really quick. How am I wrong about bonds? I want to hear.
I'll send you over the data. You didn't send me over your screenshot either, by the way.
I did. I linked it in the chat.
Let me see.
I also sent it to you on Twitter because for some reason I can't paste an image on the Streamlabs link.
Okay, well, where's the index specifically? This is the whole fucking paper. Which thing are you referencing specifically?
You're right.
What
It's
page?
33 pages, page 21. Page 21. I got it right there for you. But anyway, so anyway, send me how I'm wrong on bonds in the first place. I really don't think I am. But the point is that on your first thing, how to getting rid of Social Security altogether would be terrible. People are on average not quite so long-term thinking, and that's why we've seen huge poverty alleviation as a result of mandatory savings accounts across pretty much every single country that's had some sort of conception of mandatory retirement, whether it be a Social Security style system, superannuation in Australia, where it's basically what you described, private, sort of mandatory 401ks. So it just depends on the system. But what doesn't depend is the idea of mandatory retirement contributions and then mandatory payouts, sort of entitlement payments once you retire. People are not responsible when it comes to saving for retirement, and this is where the government comes in to alleviate part of that concern. So I disagree with the first premise of just getting rid of it altogether. Now, with regard to private mandatory 401ks, other countries do this. It wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. It would just require a lot of regulation so as to ensure that people's 401ks are managed appropriately, and so as to ensure that they're managed equitably, right? Because one of the problems with only private mandatory 401ks is that it probably wouldn't be the most equitable system because lower income people wouldn't be able to invest as much, and we'd end up with a relative amount of income inequality over time, which is probably not the best thing, all else equal. With regard to the third thing, having the government invest in the market with Social Security, sort of contributions, that's actually what I suggested in the very beginning. You say you don't really see this happening. I actually could see it as a little bit more likely than privatizing the entire system, mandatory 401ks. And this is actually what I referenced. Norway does this with their pensions. There's many local governments that do this, right? Whenever you hear about the New York Police Department pension fund, that's what they do. Universities and university endowments, that's what those are. So, many local governments do this, many state governments do this, many countries across the world do this with various funds and treasuries that they can pull money from. So I actually see that as somewhat likely.
Okay, got you. So your problem with my position of just getting rid of the system altogether is that you think that it'll have a negative effect on the elderly, essentially.
I would go so far as to say that I know it would have a negative effect on the elderly.
Right. So here's the thing, and here's my proposition to you. Tell me why it's immoral.
Why? What is immoral?
Tell me why it's immoral for me tomorrow to opt out of the Social Security system, only focus on utilizing that money for my own personal retirement benefits rather than continuing to subsidize elderly people who paid into the system and the government can't afford to pay it back out to them because they went and spent all the fucking money.
Well, the government can afford to pay it back out to them, at least currently. But I get what you're saying. Maybe in the long term, that's a little bit more dicey. The point is just to say that the reason I think it's wrong, I think that we should have a little bit more of a collective mindset, right? To say that, hey, we're all paying into the system and we can all take out of it in the future. It turns out that that's good outcomes, right? Elderly poverty's gone down. Financial destitution of the elderly has gone down quite a bit.
So you're basing this all on positive outcomes for the elderly, right?
Yeah, I think that a society rightly can be judged by how it protects its most vulnerable people. The elderly are amongst that group.
Is it my job to protect your grandmother?
I think that it's all of our jobs to protect all of our most vulnerable in a society. I would say yes.
Okay. Why is it a moral proposition that I have to protect your grandmother?
Because I think that leads to a more happy and free society, right? I mean, for instance,
So
when we all pay,
that's a preference. You're not telling me why it's moral.
Well, you want to have like a hard philosophical debate? That's fine.
No, I'm trying to understand why it is that you can't give me a reason why we shouldn't get rid of Social Security, except that you say in your preference, me taking care of your grandmother is my moral responsibility. But if I ask you to justify it, right, you seem to be struggling.
Well, I'm not really struggling. We just have to get to the fundamental question. You're asking me to sort of morally justify why it's the case that we should have a more collective mindset in this regard. My explanation for that is it leads to the most positive freedom. It leads to the best outcomes economically and materially. Now, why do I value that in the first place? kind of a utilitarian, bit of an egoist, right? I just think generally that leads to the most human happiness. That's the fundamental
Gotcha.
value
So
that I'm
under your system, you believe it gives you the most utils. That's how you're justifying this, right?
utility, happiness, whatever you want to call it, lack of
Right.
suffering.
Right. Well, we'll just call utils in this particular case. People not starving to death and dying right in the street, because apparently that's what was happening with elderly people before. This would be maximum utils in your worldview.
I think a society with the least possible people starving is probably maximizing utility to some extent. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So in your worldview, then, I just want to make sure I get this right.
Get it right.
You think that the reason that I should be subsidizing your grandmammy who paid into the Social Security system and at some point it's not able to pay her back out is because, well, that gives maximum utility to society, rather than holding the government accountable for the fact that they spent all the fucking money, never put any of it in a lockbox, because if they had put every dime of it in a lockbox, they never would have had this problem to begin with, right?
The Social Security money is in a lockbox. That's what the trust fund of Social Security is. It's an accumulation of surplus payments that have been invested into treasuries over time.
If everybody 1-to-1 who paid a dime into Social Security and was given back the same dime that they put in, that would be a lockbox. You could never actually run out of money then, could you?
Well, no, that's not true, because what you're assuming. No, because what you're assuming is that birth rates have stayed the same over time. So it's entirely possible.
Rates. If a person pays into the system, they get out of the system. That's it. Right? If that would be an actual lockbox scenario, meaning if you paid $1 out of your money into Social Security, they gave you the $1 back. But that's not how the system works. If it was always 1-to-1 this way, every dime you put in was set aside specifically for you, Econoboi, or you, Andrew Wilson. And then when you retired, it was paid back out to you. That would be an actual lockbox system, but that's not what we have.
I get what you're saying now. So yeah, that system would be kind of terrible for a lot of reasons. So the reason would be that obviously there'd be a period of time where you'd have to wait 40 years to actually have any elderly people protected by the system. This is what we had before Social Security, where basically all elderly people either had to save for their own retirement personally, or what was more likely the case, which is what led to so much elderly poverty before Social Security, was that they had to rely on hopefully their kids or their grandkids would take care of them. But the reality was that they either able.
So wait.
To do
the big problem here is that people would have to have waited until they had put enough money in to start taking money out. Well, that's insane. That's almost like some type of viable system that would have worked.
No, so what it is fundamentally is a system by which we would have a lot more elderly poverty than we would already. This is what you're not contending with. The reality is that before Social Security, we had way more elderly people in poverty and financial destitution than we did after Social Security, right? And what you are saying is that, well, hold on, let me finish, is that what you are saying is that for 40 entire years, we should have a system by which that entire 2 generations of elderly people, I should say several generations of elderly people, are put into that same sort of financial destitution than they were before. Now, what I can't see as a morally justifiable belief is the idea that it's better to send all of those people into poverty when we have clearly a system that works, but rather a system that just needs more funding. I think that's perfectly reasonable.
That's it's a bifurcation, and you're lying. It's not an either or. It's not you're sending them all to poverty, right? Under a deontological ethical system, it's important that people are responsible for themselves. What about that portion of the ethics? So you're saying that society collectively is responsible based on maximum utility in order to take care of your grandmammy who didn't plan accordingly for her own retirement. And that needs to come at our expense, rather than demanding that people take personal responsibility. And I can't even ask that you just take, if you're going to take my money, that you just hold it in a lockbox for when I retire and actually give it back to me. No, that's too much to ask. What we should do instead is continuously have the young subsidize the old until we run into an insolvency issue where you have to raise all the fucking taxes. That sounds like a far more unethical system to me, Econoboi.
Yeah, the young are subsidizing the old in either system. The only difference is that one system is actually a lot more
No, they're
effective at
not.
alleviating. Well, hold on. One system is actually a lot more effective at alleviating elderly poverty, and one isn't. Right? Either, for instance, if you're a good son, hopefully, at least if your mom was a good mom and you were a good son, if your mom ends up with no retirement savings by the time they retire, guess where she's going to end up living? With you. Guess where that not that brain drain, but guess where that fiscal drain is going to come from? It's not going to come in the form of taxation. It's going to come in the form of middle and lower class people's paychecks going towards, guess what? Paying for their parents to live with them. But here's the thing, right? We don't actually have to do that.
Well, now. They have to do that right this second. What are you talking about?
No. But the system is a lot better than the alternative, right? So, for instance, one of the stats that I quoted you that you refused to engage with up to this point was that shared living condition, financial independence for the elderly, more like, has gone up significantly.
I've conceded this. So
okay, so
my response to it is so what?
Well, no, but you can't both challenge the theoretical, but then accept the empirics, because the theoretical is based on the empirics, right? The empiric is that
I'm not doing that. What are you talking about?
Let me finish the point. The point is to say that the financial independence of the elderly has gone up over time, right? What you said was, what the fuck are you talking about? People are already having to pay a shitload for their parents. What I said was actually that problem's been alleviated significantly by Social Security. So which is it?
Okay, so let's back up. So
all right, let's back up.
If you're a person right now who receives the maximum of Social Security as an elderly person, and that's all that you have to live on, do you know what the maximum amount is?
I think it's probably $3,000 a month. I'm not really sure. If
I think it's 2,000. I think it's 2,800. I think it's 2,800 a month is your max. Okay, so how high on the hog do you think a person's living with $2,800 a month?
I think
that's all they got.
Yeah, that's essentially an on average living wage. So I mean, you're probably living paycheck to paycheck. Let's say
that's an on average living wage, $2,800.
2,800 a month. What does that come to? About 32 grand a year?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about $15-16 an hour.
You think that that's a living wage for somebody who's elderly, or are they also getting? Are they getting Medicare for all of their needs when it comes to what they need at the doctor, their medications, things like this? It's a massive, huge entitlement drain on the system. What I'm telling you is that no matter what, elderly people, for the most part, are receiving help from their children, one form or another. What I'm saying to you is that this would not have to happen at all had the government kept their money in a lockbox for the day that they actually needed it. They could take it in one lump sum. Think about what you could do with that. You could pay off an entire house. You could pay for basically whatever the fuck you wanted, and you would get all of it back. Wouldn't that be something? That's the most moral system. If you're going to say we absolutely have to nanny state you into a state of we don't trust you to plan for your own retirement, why not take the money, hold the money, and then actually give it all back to them when it's time for them to retire?
Well, because again, we've tried that system before in the form of not having any sort of government-sponsored retirement system. Now, I get what you're saying. Well, what if we had the government-sponsored system? We just held the money for 40 years or however long until you decided to retire. I understand what you're saying. The issue is that there's a huge benefit gap between that 40 years of entire generations of elderly people.
Called taking your medicine.
Well, if taking your medicine for society in societal scales is a bunch of elderly people going homeless and hungry, then I'm just not willing to do that, especially when we can prove that that's a perfectly avoidable outcome based on our current system. See, you're advocating
it's a perfectly good outcome under the system that you're advocating, which is that the young never-endingly subsidize the old, and you're always going to run into a problem when you have more old people than young people to subsidize them. That's also not sustainable. What I'm advocating for is the most sustainable, unchanging system. You never have to change it because it could never go wrong. Every dime you give, you get back at the time that you retire. It's the most moral system. It's the most congruent. There's no way for it to go wrong, right? Instead, you want to fuck all of that up because you say, what about a 40-year gap? What do you do about all the elderly people who were there before then? I didn't implement the fucking policy, and I don't have a moral obligation to take care of them.
Well, look, I don't think that there's anything moral in a society where you've got people that have paid into a system their entire lives and they don't get anything back from it. And I don't think there's anything moral about
You
letting
reap as
all of
you
those.
sow.
There,
If you
well, they
you reap
didn't
as you
show
sow.
anything, right? They
Well,
approved of the
they
system. Yeah, go
hmm
on.
they
So,
did.
well, okay. So, as far as I'm aware, the individual elderly people paying into the system probably aren't all political actors that are conniving in the background to get higher Social Security payments. They just vote for what they want every 4 years. I'm not sure it's necessarily the same thing. I'm not sure you could say that they deserve to be homeless or hungry because they didn't contribute to their own personal retirement. They expected this entitlement to be there when they retired, and I think that's a reasonable expectation based on the system we've
It's
implemented.
not a
Now,
reasonable expectation. It's a fool's expectation.
you don't think it's
Only a fool has the expectation that some benevolent government is going to make sure that they're taken care of in their elderly years.
well,
Okay,
you're
that's a
trusting the you're
fool's
well,
errand.
wait, but now you're talking out of both sides of your mouth here. On one hand, you're saying, "Oh, well, in fact, we can't trust the government to save their money," but that's exactly what the system you're describing is put it in a lockbox. Well, who's to say that the evil, a greedy-handed government isn't going to take that lockbox and amend it over time? I think
That's
that it's
likely exactly what they'll do, which is why my actual position on this, right from the beginning, was to tell you that I would prefer to abolish the system. But if you absolutely couldn't do that, if you just have to have some type of retirement based on you saying, I don't trust people with their own money, and I don't think that we should allow them to deal with the outcomes of whatever happens when they spend all of it irresponsibly, at least in that case, we should put it in some type of lockbox.
Well, wait. So, let's get away from the lockbox discussion. I think it's a terrible policy solution. Let's talk about what you actually believe in, then, which is getting rid of Social Security altogether. So,
Mm-hmm.
why do you think that's the better system, getting rid of Social Security
Because
altogether?
it's the only system that's moral.
And why do you say that?
The
Go for it.
justification for the morality is very simple. You reap as you sow. So what ends up happening to most people who are broke by the time they're 70 or 60 or this and that, there's a direct correlation between that and their life's choices, almost always. People who
So,
make terrible choices are not people who should be subsidized at the teat of everybody else just because they made terrible choices with how they set aside their money and what they did. Now, there are certain people that through no fault of their own, maybe they're disabled, things like this, but they're mostly outliers. And there are charitable organizations that are there to help those people. But just to say that because you reach a certain age, you're entitled to be given $2,800 a month for the rest of your fucking life is absurd. And there's no moral proposition or backing for it.
yeah, in a system that you paid into your whole life, I think that there's a little bit
You
of a
were
difference
forced
there.
to. You were forced to pay into it.
I understand, right? But it seems like you're implying that you're
So you're
getting that
saying
money
that
for it. Well, hold on, let me finish.
morality for this is they put a gun to your head, they take your money, okay, and then you say, "Well, give it to me," right? This is what you consider to be the morality of your system.
Well, I'm not sure how you're getting the connection there. I mean, again, these are entitlements they're called entitlements because you've paid into the system your whole life. There's only a few
Oh no,
groups of people.
it was taken from you. You didn't pay for it. Most people don't even realize that it's being taken. In fact,
Well, as
most
far as I'm
people
aware,
don't even.
Social Security has a pretty high approval rating. I'm not sure you can make that argument.
It has a large approval rating among voters who aren't young people. Almost always, they're not young people. It's
Well, look,
older people who set policy, and it's older people like the AARP, like you said, who demand endlessly that they be given these entitlements.
yeah. Well, look, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if we were to poll the broad population, not just the old people who are stealing money from the young people, and ask them, how do you feel about Social Security? I'm sure that Social Security has a broad set of
It
support.
does well in public polling, but just
Well, there you
because
go.
something's popular doesn't mean it's moral. You
I
asked for my
understand.
justification on whether or not it's moral. What I'm telling you is that people who vote in most of the politicians are people who want that entitlement. They're older, right? They have literally been able to vote to raid the public treasury. Now, there was no reason at all for such a system to ever exist except under a lockbox if you absolutely had to make one. But the most moral thing to do is let people reap as they sow. You still
Sure.
haven't contended with why it is that that's an immoral proposition.
Well, you haven't allowed me to, so let me contend with it right now. So let me ask you a few questions. So do you think people should be entirely individually held accountable?
Yeah, for the most part.
Okay. Well, for the most part, what's an example of a situation where
Like
someone should not?
there's possible circumstances that are so far outside of control. Like for instance, I don't know, a fucking meteorite strikes your house or something. There's outliers to everything. Nothing exists in a complete monolith. So when I
Sure.
say for the most part, I'd say like 99% yes.
Well, I guess I understand that. I would just say that a philosophical bedrock should in theory be 100%. But let's just contend with that for a second.
Well, that's
there.
insane, but okay. Because nothing's ever 100% anything in reality.
So you don't think that you don't think your philosophical persuasion should be consistent and ever
Well, it
applicable?
can't listen, that's not the way stats work. Like there is a statistical chance you could jump off your roof, turn into a balloon and float off. Did you know that? There is a statistical chance. Yeah, it's possible, right? But the likelihood of it is extraordinarily small as to be considered impossible. So this is why you can't say everything is 100%, but you can say like for the most part, almost always.
Do you believe in a public police force?
Sure.
Well, why? Why are you forcing me to subsidize your security?
I'm not. Those are local levies.
Well, the local government forcing me to do something by gunpoint is any better than the federal government? That doesn't make any sense. They are. They're forcing me.
They're not. It's a local levy. It's a local levy. And by the way, just so you know, most fire departments, for instance, in most areas are volunteer. They don't get paid.
I didn't say anything about firemen.
When it comes to a police department, you're talking about local levies, and they're not based on payroll taxes, right? They're usually based around things like property taxes, things like this.
Sales tax.
So again, these are not equatable things.
So you're saying? Well, let me jump in. Well, hold on, because it's valuable.
I'm trying to finish the point. So
all right, finish it.
The point being is very simple. Okay, at the local level, with a local magistrate, if people collectively come together and they're like, "Look, we're going to pay this guy for our security," there's nothing wrong with that. That's far different than having a vote on something, 60 years prior, or something that was passed 60 years prior that you have to live with, okay? And when it fails, you make endless demands that we prop it up. These are not analogous situations.
It's perfectly analogous, and I'll explain why. So as far as I'm aware, the institution of the police is actually pretty damn old. It's probably older than Social Security. If I had to guess, we probably had police more, before Social Security existed. But I would say that you could make the exact same analysis under your framework with regard to the police. You're saying I don't actually own my home. You're saying unless I'm forcibly made to by gunpoint, by threat of violence, to pay a portion of the value of my house to the government, I'll go to jail. They'll seize my property, all because you want me to subsidize your security. Why don't you just responsibly take the money and pay for your own security, Andrew? How is that any more moral?
I don't have a problem with people doing that. I also don't think that property taxes are a great idea. That what property taxes do is they strip cross-generational wealth by design.
No, but
so
you said
I absolutely think that it would be fine. Stop and let me finish. There's no pivot. Just because I'm telling you that it's okay for people, if they want to collectively hire a police force, I don't have a problem with that. Why would that be problematic? You're the one who inserted that the money had to come from property taxes, so I can dismiss that because I didn't say that's where it needs to come from. Yeah, all I mentioned is how it's paid for at the local level, but literally against property taxes.
Okay, well, let's say it's a sales tax. I mean, what you're telling me that I have to pay 8 or 9% more for all of my goods because you can't fund your own security? That's ridiculous, Andrew. What the fuck? Why are you stealing my money?
Get rid of police departments. I'm fine with that too. But that aside, it's not directly analogous to say that people who are at a younger generation who've never had an opportunity to even vote on this ever, like they would for a local levy for your police department, have to endlessly subsidize the elderly because they lobby politicians to make sure that they're getting an entitlement. Were you allowed to vote on Social Security?
Hey, there's many nut jobs.
Were you allowed to vote on Social Security?
Hold on, let me finish.
Just say yes or no.
Okay?
It's a yes or no.
Hold
Were you or
no,
not?
No, it's not a yes or no. Nobody was ever allowed to vote on Social Security. We
Got
don't
it.
have a direct.
Are you always allowed to vote on your local property levies?
First of all, the answer, at least in my city, is yes. Second
Yes.
of all, hold on. That's not true in every city, though, Andrew. We have to speak in broad generalities. We could broaden it to the military, for instance, right? Do you think that we shouldn't have a military?
No, we should absolutely have a military.
Well, once again, Andrew, what the fuck? Why are you taking part of my income to fund a military when you could just, again, hire your own security? Why do you need me to subsidize your defense?
I don't need you to subsidize my defense. Here's what you should honestly do with taxes. You should get rid of income. I'm trying to explain. Well, because I'm trying to explain, it's more complex than yes or no. This is why I say no. It has a presupposition. It's preloaded. So let's try to flesh this out. What I'm telling you is that if you do not have direct impact as to where your taxes are going and why, that you generally have an immoral system. That's my overarching point here. So when we're talking about this, what you're doing is making comparisons that are not analogous. And you do this over and over and over again and pretend that they're analogous. You were never able to vote in Social Security taxes ever. Never. And neither was anybody else ever. Not ever. Now, when you're talking about privatizing your security, when it comes to police forces, your local levies are something that you directly participate in. Same thing with schools. You directly participate in that. All of those things you have some say in. You don't have any say over Social Security. You never have had any say over Social Security.
You do.
It's not analogous. Same thing with military spending. Same exact fucking problem there. So what I'm saying to you is that they're not directly analogous because they operate differently.
So the military is directly analogous, you would say, because we never voted in the military funding that we have today.
That's true, but military spending is a drop in the bucket compared to entitlements. Even though it's the second largest, it's still not nearly as large as our entitlement programs.
But you've already not conceded, but you've eschewed away the issue of scale. This is now a debate about morality, right? And so in theory, the scale shouldn't matter. One immoral thing versus 10 million immoral things. Sure, you might say one's the bigger problem. However, they're the same fundamental immorality, right? And so what you would say is that it's immoral the fact that we fund the military in the way that we do, similar to how it's immoral the fact that we fund Social Security in the way that we do. I think that this is wrong, and I think it's wrong for a number of reasons. Number one, I agree that we never had any referendum on the establishment of Social Security back in the 1930s. We never did the same thing when it comes to the military. We don't have referendums in this country. Many countries do, but we don't. Many states do, but we're talking about federal issues here. So I get what you're saying. However, you're free at any point in time to advocate for the abolition of Social Security. You're free to advocate for
You're fucking lying. We do have referendums. We have them at the local level all the time.
No, Andrew, I already said we do have local referendums, but we're talking about a federal issue. Social Security and the military are federalized systems. So you just missed what I said, before I started on my response,
but
right?
Neither one of them are supposed to be. The Congress is only supposed to allocate money for a Navy, and that's it, and only have an army in the time of war. States are the ones who are supposed to raise their own military. We do that system now called the National Guard. So that system should be immediately done away with.
We're not making a legal. We're having a moral debate.
I'm talking about this is what is moral. Same thing. We're talking about two things here. When we're talking about the morality of what should happen with the military, if the military was levied at the local level, would you have a say in it?
No, not necessarily.
Well, yes, necessarily, because referendums do happen at the local level, yeah.
Every single city and county has a totally different way for how they determine funding for certain things. So there's no guarantee that if this thing was devolved into local administration, you'd have any more saying to it. That's like saying that because Bill Clinton block granted out all of the welfare spending that we do for things like SNAP and in food stamps and unemployment insurance, that's like saying that because he did that, we all of a sudden have a morally righteous way by which we allocate unemployment insurance.
So tell me something now that we're getting to the heart of this, because I got to know. All right.
All right.
If we have if we have Social Security gone tomorrow, will the entire country collapse?
No, we wouldn't devolve into some sort of anarchist.
What if we got rid of the
hellscape.
entire military tomorrow? Would the entire country collapse?
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah, it would probably fucking collapse, right? There wouldn't be a fucking nation here in which to argue about Social Security.
Well, no, but
they're
now,
not.
see,
they're not scalable. And by the way, these institutions were put into place before I was ever born. Me saying that I don't think that this is a moral proposition for the military is true. Just as much as I say it's not a moral proposition for Social Security, they're both immoral. But this is the system I exist in, so I can only advocate for the ones that I can do something about. Social Security I can do something about. The military I can't.
Well, no, but here's the thing, right? You've now acquiesced to a certain part of my frame of reference, my frame of thinking, right? So what you've said is that this is a moral debate. We're having a moral debate, right? So yes, the military is just as immorally funded and administered as the Social Security is. Like, okay, fair enough, whatever. But at the same time, you'd say we shouldn't get rid of the military because society would collapse. I'm practically thinking that one of the pragmatic implications of getting rid of the military is societal collapse. And however, I'm not thinking of the.
If I say,
hold on,
no, because you're lying. It's not analogous again.
I'm directly repeating what you said. You said that the scale by which what would happen if we got rid of either system is different, and that's why I evaluate. I'm not cherry picking.
Yeah, you are cherry picking because I said both of
you just said.
Okay, can you preface it with this? Andrew Wilson believes that the way the military is funded right now is immoral, and the way that Social Security is funded right now is immoral. Can you say both of those things, then go ahead with your diatribe?
I literally said that in the very beginning. What I said was, and I'll repeat again in case you didn't hear it the first time.
Yeah, I didn't.
You said the way that the government funds and administers the military and Social Security are immorally wrong in an equivalent sense. However,
yes.
And that's what you clearly didn't hear me because that's exactly what I said in the first place. However, you would say that the scale by which and the logistics of getting rid of the military, a practical implication, is what prevents me from getting rid of the military. However, although there are practical implications to getting rid of Social Security, they're not as big a deal, right? So all that I'm saying is that now that we have inserted a practical implication into the debate.
Oh, I see. So we ought not do anything about the things we find immoral if we can't do everything about everything that's immoral. That's insane.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that my way to view and how we fund and administer these systems are practical implications. I would say that at least by my subjective line ultimately, which ultimately this is a subjective line that we've both established independently, is that millions of elderly people going into poverty and possibly being homeless and hungry, that's my line. I think that that's worse than the society that we have today. What you are saying is that that's not my line. My line is total societal collapse. We disagree on the line.
No, mine doesn't operate off subjectivism. I say that both. No, I didn't. You said that because you're a consequentialist. I literally told you specifically both of these institutions are immoral. There's just one institution I can do something about, and there's one that I can't do anything about. That's the difference. I can still say both of them are immoral systems. I object to both. I think the funding for the way that both of them are funded are fucking terrible, and that should be changed tomorrow. But there's one of those things I can actually do something about. We're coming up on the insolvency of the thing, right? So there's actually a possibility that this can be revamped or abandoned. There's nothing I can do about the military, though.
There's everything in the world you can do about the military in the same frame that you could do about Social Security. You can vote in representatives that reflect your beliefs, right? So the mechanisms by which you would reform either system are the exact same. You are just simply saying
they're not, because right now one's coming to the forefront and the other one is not.
No. We're not talking about the funding of either one. We're talking about the mechanism. You said I can't do anything about it, right? So what that implies to me is that there's no sort of electoral or institutional way for me to reform these systems. However, that's not true. The ways that we would reform these systems, you are allowed to reform them in the exact same way, either one. However, what you said earlier in this debate was that hold on, stop interrupting me real quick.
Go ahead.
Hold on. Well, I agree with that. The only difference here is that what you're saying is that the implications of getting rid of the military are so grave that I can't do it. However, the implications of getting rid of Social Security...
No, it's not the implications of it. It's that one is possible for me to do something about right now. The other one is not possible for me to do something about right now.
Why
That's
is it not
it.
possible for you
Well,
to
all
vote
I
in a
could
referendum? Hold
do,
on, hold on. Why is
all
it
I
not
can do is
possible for you
advocate.
to hold on? Just let me ask the
Okay.
question. Why is it not possible for you to vote in a representative right now that could reform the way that the military functions
We
in a similar way
advocate,
with Social Security?
yes, we advocate for such representatives to go into office all the time. The difference is that right now we're facing an existential crisis where this is going to become insolvent. So it's at the forefront. Since it's at the forefront, people are starting to look at it. Now is when you can advocate and actually get changes to it done. The military system within the massive industrial complex that it is, we would have to wait for some type of catastrophe likely before you would have anything on the ground actually change circumstances to where you could start to remove funding or shift funding, have more local levies, start pulling us out of other nations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's basically a practicality method. There's nothing that can be done by you or I about the military industrial complex yet, except advocate for politicians. Sure, I do that all the time, right? But Social Security, since it's in the forefront, it's in the public eye, that is something we can look at.
So if Social Security was allowed to be run through a deficit, would you say the same thing? Because that's how we're currently funding the military.
What do you mean? Do you mean?
So it sounds like what you're saying, and maybe I should have reframed it in the first place. It sounds like what you're saying is that because Social Security is having a funding shortfall projected in the future, we can do something, or it's like more urgent to do something about Social Security today. However, the military doesn't have that problem because we don't have like a segregated funding mechanism for the military. It's all general discretionary funds. So what I'm asking is that if it were the case that we could just pull from general funds, or we could just take on a deficit by which to fund Social Security,
yeah, it wouldn't change the fact. It wouldn't change the fact that it was an immoral proposition. It might change the fact that I could do something about it, though.
Okay, this is, I guess, fundamentally in the last portion of this debate where I think that this is kind of an incoherent ideology, right? And at the very least, it's self-admitted, not perfectly applicable in every scenario, which I think is a little bit weird for a philosophical system. Is that you're basically saying that the funding mechanism is what determines my advocacy, at least in terms of getting rid of an immoral system. In theory, it shouldn't necessarily matter if it's immoral. It's immoral. Whereas you're saying, no, it's actually the opposite. It's practical implications. It's necessarily subjective, because what you're saying is that the subjective way by which we determined how to fund this system is what is subjectively determining my ability to do anything about it. I think that's a little absurd. I'm just the one that's saying that it is actually a subjective line. You're trying to pretend that it isn't.
So to get this right, because I don't want to straw man this, what you're saying to me is that within a moral system, you shouldn't do anything about the problems that you can do something about because it's subjective.
No, what I'm saying is that you are pretending your system is not subjective when I think that it entirely is. I don't think that your system of morality is any more superior than mine when it comes to evaluating whether or not we should have Social Security. Like,
well,
on
that's
a principle
nice
level.
that that's your fucking opinion, but that doesn't mean anything to me that that's your opinion. The deontological system is very simple. So I don't know what you mean. I understand consequentialists think that they have some type of valid argumentation that they can make for consequentialism. That's what makes them consequentialists. So yes, it would be a difference of opinion. I'm glad that you think it's subjective. I do not. What I've held, again, is a consistent line across the board about what's moral, what's immoral. What I've said is that there's something I can do about this one thing that's immoral, and there's nothing I can do right now about this other thing, except try to vote in politicians, I suppose, which is what we do right now. But it's not at the forefront. It's not the public eye. By the way, once again, military is not Social Security, which was the topic of the debate. And I'm telling you again that Social Security is an immoral proposition based on the fact that you reap as you sow. And if you sow poorly, you reap poorly.
All right. Well, I guess we can move off of it and get into. I don't know if you wanted to do the 7-minute closing statements or whatever, but to go a little bit longer on this, I would just say that the way that I would frame my morality, if you want to pick apart this to a little bit of a certain extent, is that I would say that the things that give people the most positive freedom are probably a good thing, and I think that it's proven based on empirical justification that Social Security is one of those things to do. And I would say that if the worst case scenario were to come to pass, and we either had to change the regulation to take on a deficit to fund Social Security, or God forbid we had to raise taxes on wealthier people plus a marginal tax rate increase on the lower and middle income people, it's a good investment, Social Security. That's how I would frame it. I think that that's a perfectly applicable moral framework in essentially most every circumstance. And that's how I would view Social Security from a moral standpoint.
Okay. Is that your closing statement?
No, I was offering. I'm framing my philosophical justification for Social Security in case you wanted to, perhaps take it apart in some way or another. I've questioned you a lot on your framing this entire.
No,
second
I
half of
believe 100% that within the framework of consequentialism, that's coherent and it makes sense.
All right.
I've never said that consequentialist thinking is incoherent. I just disagree with it fundamentally. You understand the difference?
I guess so. I would say that.
First
I guess
and
I would go a
foremost,
step
you
further.
need to understand two things. One,
All right,
oftentimes consequentialism and deontological thinking, they coexist, so they cross paths. Sometimes deontological thinking is consequentialism. Sometimes consequentialism would be something that's deontological. They overlap a bit. Okay, I've always said that utilitarianism is consistent. I just disagree with it.
All right, that's fair. I think I would say that your moral system, at least by my ear, perhaps the comments would judge otherwise, is inconsistent. And of course, I also
What's inconsistent?
Well, what's inconsistent is saying that because of an arbitrary funding mechanism, we can do something about one system.
No. Stop.
I'm stopping.
What's inconsistent about me saying these two things are immoral?
No, there's nothing inconsistent with that.
Okay, well then that's what. Hey, then shut up. That's all we were talking about. Stop.
Yeah. Goodness.
If you say that there's no inconsistency in me saying that both of these things are immoral, that's it. You agree with my system.
No. I would only agree. No. Even if I agreed with that statement, I would only agree that it's consistent. I wouldn't agree with your system.
That's exactly what I just said to you. Now you understand, right? Now you get it. Now it just clicked for fucking Econoboi. Oh, that's funny. Go ahead, man. Floor is yours.
So the legitimacy of my system, and not necessarily the consistency. That's the difference here. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to ask. If you wanted to ask me questions, go for it. Otherwise, we could get into.
Yeah. I do. Because that last snarky statement you made when I just blew you out on it.
I'll blew me out on it.
Yeah, I did. But I'll go back to this again. What you're saying is your moral system is consistent, Andrew. I just disagree with where it leads. Isn't that actually correct?
Well, okay. Again, so I would say if you wanted to be hyper specific, what I would say is that you're being consistent by saying they're both immoral, but you're being inconsistent by how you act upon those morals, which I think is
right.
Sort of.
So this is my same problem.
Let me one last sentence.
This is my problem
that sort of implies that there's some sort of inconsistency by which you view the world morally or ethically.
No, that would be your way. As a consequentialist, you just use abstractions, right? So you just say, look, I think that this has more utility than that based on my feelings. That's essentially it. It's all just based on your feelings. So you'll say things like, we ought to take care of elderly people if we can, because I feel that way. It gives the most utils to society because I feel that way, right?
Well, you're saying people should take care of themselves because you feel that that's the best system.
No, I'm going to use an actual moral axiom called the Bible, and I've said it over and over again. You reap as you sow. It's an actual axiom to base my moral system on. Yours is purely subjective. For $10, Jonathan Dow says moral Social Security sounds like it would be a breeze to administer. I would happily donate my time voluntarily. Sure does, doesn't it?
Well, it's a good thing Social Security spends so little on administration, I guess. But, I would just say that there's no need to get into a Bible debate. What I would just say is that the only thing I'll say to this to avoid getting into an extended debate on the Bible is to say that I do not think we can objectively prove that the Bible is like the best way to form our morality. I think that that would be a subjective choice, choosing between the Bible and all manner of other philosophical and moral texts, whether they be religious or irreligious. I am only recognizing that there is some subjective preference by which we view the world in a moral and ethical sense, and I am arguing that practically and empirically, and based on the value of positive freedom, that my system is the best one to carry that out.
Right, by using my money to subsidize elderly people.
Hey, by using your money to pay for my security. Sounds
Right.
like we believe in somewhat the same system, at least in a practical lens.
Well, we don't have a choice. We were born into it. That doesn't make it a
pesky
moral.
democracy.
That doesn't make it a moral system, nor does it make democracy moral either. But I'll let you get to your closing statements, and then I'll make mine afterwards. Go ahead, man.
All right. Well, it was a good debate. Yet another W for Econoboi. I'll take it. It was a great one. Sorry that everyone had to see the slaughtering that just took place. I do apologize for that. The reality is, BPF and I are perfectly amicable behind the scenes, at least so far, up to this point. My closing statement on the actual issue is just to say that, without getting into a bunch of philosophical stuff, I feel like that's a bit of a boring debate personally. At least for me, it is personally. I prefer the more empirics and data-driven arguments in general. Not that I'm unprepared for the philosophical ones. It's just the data is more interesting to me. And what the data shows to me is that if you value, at least fundamentally, in some extent, the alleviation of human suffering and the increase of human happiness in the form transitively of being in poverty or not being in poverty, respectively, then Social Security is a very good system by which we can accomplish that goal of alleviating human suffering. BPF talked throughout the debate about, or at least he mentioned it in his opening statement, and we didn't really get into it as much, and except for the very beginning of the debate, was that, well, you have to pay more for this system over time because people are aging, the baby boom, this and that and the other. And my response to that fundamentally is, okay, that's okay, fundamentally, because Social Security is a great system. It is okay to invest in systems that are good. For instance, if we had a profitable project as a business and that project required, 10% more capex, but we could make 20% return on it, I wouldn't be arguing in front of the board that this is a terrible investment because by the fact that we just have to invest more in capital expenditure in this project. That's kind of a dumb way to justify being against a system. That's why we pivoted into the moral debate, because that justification doesn't make any sense. Social Security is a great investment, and it always has been, and I think that it'll continue to be a great investment in the future.
Okay, so in my closing statement, let me just point out that I called exactly how this would go from the very beginning of the debate when I said my opponent will likely just say, let's increase the payroll tax, shifting the burden on the working class and on the lower class. And then he went on to basically define that that's exactly what he wanted to do, right? He came up with a bunch of other shit, but when he was pressed on it, he would always come back to the payroll tax. And this is essentially what he wants to do. When it's all said and done, he wants to shift the burden onto the middle class and lower class to keep on subsidizing the elderly rather than take the hit and then put everything in a lockbox and just pay it back to him if he doesn't trust people to take care of their own financial well-being. He didn't want to contend with that very much, except to say, what about that 40-year gap? Tough shit. Sorry that there's a 40-year gap. I'm sorry that life's not fair. I'm sorry that I won't support a system that's fundamentally horrific, that's going to go insolvent and continue to go insolvent based on demographic shifts. You're just putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. Okay? That's all you're doing. And we're going to continue this process over and over and over and over again. Okay? Anytime you have the young subsidize the old, you always run the gambit of eventually the birth rates falling down so low that you can no longer support the elder class. The money has to come from somewhere. So they are always going to shift the burden onto who again? The working class every single time. The reason that morality was brought up was because Econoboi specifically asked me, why is it that you're against such system? I said, because it was an immoral system fundamentally based on my worldview. That's why we ended up there. It wasn't a pivot. It was a direct answer to a question. And so we ended up tangling over it. I was consistent in my moral system, and he expressed that I was consistent on my morals, even though he tried to at first say that I wasn't. When I pressed him on it, he had to say that I was. He just disagreed with the outcomes. And why wouldn't he? He's a fucking consequentialist, and that's what they do, is they just disagree with about outcomes, even though they don't know what the outcomes are actually going to be. They never do, ever. They just project. And then what ends up happening when we actually get to the time where we see the outcome, we see 9 out of 10 times that whatever they predicted was fucking wrong, which is why universal axioms for morality are far better. They tend to predict what's going to happen much easier if everybody lives in the same framework, rather than let's just do what we think is going to always have the bestest results. Though I can say that sometimes you do want to look at consequences that should not be the end all be all for your moral framework. So yes, kind of went all over the place. This was a broad topic. It was an interesting one to get into with Econoboi. I'm sure he'll post this, like he said, and say, look, it's another W for Econoboi. Not even close. He got trashed hard, and it wasn't difficult to do.